In order to fully explain the societal systems approach to political analysis, we can't really start with the even simplified complex societal systems model. There's just too much information. There's too many units involved in the societal dynamics in order to understand how they're going to interact and what to expect from the outcomes of that interaction. The only way really to increase our ability to comprehend this level of complexity is to deconstruct the complex model, even in its most simplified form, to its component units. And the theory of societal systems analysis is based on the proposition that all social units are essentially the same, organized in the same basic way, when they are measured according to the nature of the relationships amongst the units that constitute what we would refer to as the social identity group. Human beings, as was proposed earlier, are naturally social, and they tend to form into self-actuating, self-organizing, self-regulating, self-correcting social identity groups. And that the groups that they form are based on their own interests, their own needs, and any individual can be members of one or more or even hundreds of different groups. And they will interact with members of other groups, and this is what knits complex societal systems together and reproduces them, makes them persist over time. The only active unit within any social system, of course, is the individuals themselves. And the only time we can really talk about a social group as having a identifiable or observable purpose or intent or to imply intent or to observe a social or collective action is to see how individuals act collectively. And so this model can be thought of also as the aggregate individual model, in that it's looking at aggregate behaviors. And those aggregate behaviors are behaviors that are directed by the group and are consistent with the group's purpose and their goals. So this model that I'm going to introduce now is the social identity group model. It derives from the discussion of George Simmel and his discussion of social forms. What it's based on is what seems to be clear from the model. It's a mathematical representation of social relationships based on a Gaussian distribution or a normal distribution. This, of course, is the same distribution that forms the basis of statistical analysis. But this approach to analysis differs substantively from a statistical analysis. Statistical analysis looks at traits and the distribution of those traits as they apply to individuals, but it's based on a measure of a single trait. And the quality of that trait across a group of individuals, it's proposed, will take on a normal distribution that many will display a central norm of that particular trait, and then there will be deviation from that norm, and that group members will not all exhibit a uniformity in any particular trait. That there'll be a distribution of qualities of this trait that can be assumed to be a normal distribution and can be used as the basis for analysis. The social identity group model, this differs substantively because group relations are measured according to two, not exactly oppositional, but inverse, to a certain extent, strategies or forms of relationships. I've already introduced these two forms. One is instrumental, which deals with force and coercion as the basis for the relationship between individuals within a group context. And the other is sociational, which is based on cooperative or coordinated efforts. In further elaborating on the difference between these two approaches, I would refer the audience to Hannah Arendt's treatment on violence, in which she differentiates between violence and power, and argues that violence is counterproductive to social relations, whereas power is actually the ability of groups to act in concert to direct their activities toward common goals. And that, contrary to the traditional understandings of power, instrumental force is one application of societal power, but it has very limited application in that it tends to destroy what I call associational power. It will be helpful at this point to remind the viewer that the social identity group or social forms model deals specifically and particularly with social relations at the intra-group level, that is, relations among group members. Part of what I would claim is a source of confusion over the use of the term political power in the traditional or classic sense stems from the perceived political utility in the external projection of internal power capabilities. That is, using in-group sociational power as a source of political leverage in intergroup relations with other or out groups. The concept of relative capabilities in intergroup interaction stands at the nexus between sociational power at the group level and instrumental force at the intergroup level. An imbalance of relative capabilities between political groups carries with it the implied or real threat of a use of force by the stronger group to secure favorable terms in a negotiation or resolution to a dispute. Bruce Benedict-Mesquita has shown in The War Trap that it has almost always been the stronger group that has initiated and ultimately benefited from the threat of force in such situations. This conflation of positive or proactive power with active or aggressive force as the source of systemic power in a self-help system, a la Kenneth Waltz, presents a serious intellectual obstacle to improving intergroup relations and systemic integration in the era of globalization. We will examine intergroup relations in more depth later in this video sequence. So, looking at the distribution, another way it differs from statistical normal distribution, and one way that it's the same. I've mentioned that it differs because it measures on two traits which can mix, but having more of one will invariably lead to having less of the other. And so individuals array within this distribution based on, in part by their nature, in part by nurture. The social group actually moves individuals to fill certain roles or holes in this distribution, and also partly by choice. And so there is free will involved in the implication or the assumptions on which this approach is based. That this curve actually does represent numbers of individuals, but the individuals are placed as units within it, and they have, according to their place in this curve, a certain combination of social dispositions on how they feel it's appropriate to interact with other members of the group. So, for instance, an individual who is, using this model in the background, is placed low on the y-axis and to the far left on the x-axis, means that they have a disposition to prefer the use of instrumental force in their interactions with other group members. And they have a disposition to prefer only people that they're very familiar with, a very low level of association. Even in the extreme, they could be a loner. They could prefer no association whatsoever, and that would put them really at the bottom of the y-axis. Going a little bit up from the y-axis, maybe only their most closest associates, or even just their nuclear family, could be their sphere of political interest. They don't go beyond that. And so these individuals we would refer to largely as sociopaths, that they are members of the group for whatever reason, but they don't identify very strongly with the group. They identify with the group only so far as the group serves their needs, and that they're willing to use high degrees of coercion, or even force, or even violence, in order to serve their own needs. We might even call these people extremists, and this is the nature of extremism. Looking towards the middle of the diagram, the point that's designated as relative zero. This is, of course, the 0 point on the instrumental x-axis. That is, the point on the scale that denotes instrumental neutrality. Individuals with personal dispositions that position them at this point along the x-axis can be considered to be pure cooperators. That is, they will not use coercion in any form to achieve personal goals within the social setting. The point of intersection of the two axes may be considered the point of pure individuation, or social genesis, as any deviation from this point infers some form of social interaction. As already mentioned, there is a substantial degree of dynamism within the social form, such that individual members enjoy social mobility as regards their societal disposition and social role over time and at any point in time. An individual's position within the group at any point in time is determined by a confluence of factors, including 1. Nature or genetic predisposition, 2. Nurture, socialization or social conditioning, 3. Learning, both experiential and intellectual, and 4. Choice, personal preference. The concept of relative zero may be better understood as referring to the entire y-axis, from the point of genesis to some technologically determined associational maximum. From this perspective, individuals positioned along the y-axis may be thought of as the backbone of the social identity group. As pure cooperators, or to use Martin Nowak's term, super cooperators, they are highly likely to engage in dense volumes of cooperative relations, have higher numbers of social connections, and act both as nodes in the social networks that knit group members together, and conduits for relaying information and facilitating transactions essential for group maintenance. Ideally, the individual positioned at the maximum y point in the social forms model, the point with coordinates 0, 19p in the accompanying diagram, should logically be empowered as chief executive in group leadership, that is, the proto-state, as this person is instrumentally neutral or impartial and associationally adept. We can reasonably expect that this person is group proactive. That is, they will promote the public good and publicly defined goals, and will do so through legitimate non-coercive means. That is, the rule of law. Democratic procedures are generally designed to favor the selective investment of such individuals with governing authority. On the other side, on the right side, we can find in the extreme the same characteristics or social dispositions that we found on the left side when I explained the extremist. But these extremists are different from the extremists on the left side in that as individuals act in instrumental ways, they have to act on another member or set of members of the social group. And so they actually create, through their active individual actions on members of the group, individuals that are affected by their actions. And this is the difference between active and reactive individuals. Active individuals see instrumental strategies as a preferred strategy for dealing with other group members to promote their personal interests, to aggrandize themselves in the social context or the social setting. The reactive individuals, on the other hand, are, whereas the active are offensive, the reactive are defensive. They have been acted on. We often look at them as the oppressed, as the common parlance goes. The active individuals have acted upon them and taken something from them, and they see a way to protect themselves from this social interaction by using instrumental force to prevent active individuals from expropriating value from them. The proactive, on the other hand, act to promote group interests over individual interests. And so we have these three basic types of individuals, but in reality we have a almost infinite variation of dispositions in individuals that form a group. And any group that has a large number of members will approximate this Gaussian distribution of these social dispositions. The Gaussian distribution of social dispositions defines the potential for individual action in the affective social setting. This potential for action should not be equated with actual behavior, except under the extreme condition of complete breakdown of the social order and an ensuing social chaos, as all individuals act within the immediacy of a survival imperative, a process that can be termed extreme individuation. Unfortunately, such extreme conditions have occurred, but fortunately these have been extremely rare, and the frequency of their occurrence has diminished as a general function of societal system development over the course of human history. Individual dispositions identify the maximum potential form of action in which a certain individual will engage in pursuit of personal interest. Individual action at any point in time results from some combination of emotive stimuli, material incentives, opportunities, self-restraint, and social constraints, and is governed by the conservation of energy principle and a cost-benefit calculus. These conflict conditioning factors will be discussed in more detail later in the video sequence when we discuss the political economy of conflict management. What is important to the current examination of the social identity group is to emphasize the inherent social tension between the active and reactive sectors. As noted, the active and reactive sectors mirror one another as instrumental self-promotion and self-protection actions create and maintain social inequalities and opposing perspectives. This inherent social tension, as pointed out by Louis Kozer, is an essential quality of the social group that drives social innovation and development and sustains group salience, that is, when this social energy is properly managed. A failure of conflict management can lead to overt instrumental behavior, factionalism, and separatism, or state failure. The proper management of social tensions relates specifically to the group's self-regulating and self-correcting nature. As you recall, the pure cooperators aligned at the relative zero, y-axis, form the backbone and even the spinal cord of the social identity group. A general characterization of the self-correcting aspect of the group can be portrayed as the two-way flow of information and transactions centered around the societal norm. Of course, this general vertical flow occurs across the normal distribution, but is most dense and reliable and impartial toward the center. This flow can be referred to as the remediation dynamic, in which the group attempts to identify, design, and implement social conflict resolution. Also important is the general horizontal flow of information and transactions, which are illustrated in the diagram at the midpoint in the social forms model, but which occur at all levels within the social network. This dynamic refers to the group's self-regulating or mediation aspect, which is steeped in the inherent social tension between the active and reactive sectors and results from the social necessity for mediating and so moderating this tension. The instrumental potential of the active and reactive sectors creates a dialectical tension driving both positive proactive resolution and a negative instrumental threat of intersectoral collective action and a possible breakdown of the social order. The combination of vertical and horizontal social dynamics provides the basis for subsidiarization as a function of increasing complexity. That is, conflict management activities targeted to the most appropriate level for resolution. That is, centrally integrated, decentralized authority in contrast to overly centralized and concentrated authority. So the curve takes on this form. Individuals within the curve will choose or will have a personal nature that moves them to adopt certain strategies. And they learn these things over time. And so there's a lot of activity and movement within this distribution, but the distribution, independently from the individuals that comprise it, maintains this social form. As the individuals move within the structure of the social group, that individuals, when they're born, will have very limited sociational power, will have very little instrumental capacity. As they grow older, the instrumental capacity increases, and their sociational capacity can increase. But they will choose what particular mixture, or they will be moved to adopt a particular mixture during their lifespan and according to their life experiences and their existential context within a group membership. So the curve takes on this shape mainly because the ideal individual, the individual that works very hard, has a long lifetime, and develops skills for interacting with other individuals, can only reach this maximum possibilities curve, the outer limit of the distribution curve. And so if you develop only your instrumental skills and have no social skills whatsoever, you can reach the extreme on the left or right of the Gaussian distribution. You are highly skilled in instrumental skills and applications, but you have very little contact with other individuals. You have very few group memberships. The only real group membership you have is with the larger group, and that is a one-way, as we like to think, a relationship, in that you associate with the group for personal aggrandizement and act instrumentally with the group. Often these people are criminal, and because if they act out on these predispositions or these proclivities, the actions that they partake in are often viewed as criminal activities, and they violate the law of the group. The law of the group, of course, the rule of law, what holds the the social identity grouped together is this central norm of nonviolence, that whatever norms bring members to the group and keep the group salient are the law of that group, and those laws over time will be codified so that group members will know what those laws are, can refer to those laws when they're trying to make determination on what social justice might entail. But every group has these norms, whether they're codified or not. These norms are understood by members of the group, and members of the group place themselves in relationship to these norms, these group norms, which act as the relative zero, the central tendency in the Gaussian distribution. So, having individuals arrayed in this way makes all social units coherent, cohesive, and comparable. And so the societal systems approach, unlike a lot of quantitative analysis in political science or the social sciences in general, is based not on statistical or econometric analysis. It's based on macro-comparative analysis, which you have an array of units that are either similar or dissimilar, but at some level of comparison, they are the same. And so these are the basic building blocks of social complexity, and all building blocks assume this shape and form and contain this array of diversity amongst individuals. That this differs from many of the approaches, analytical approaches in social sciences, in that it does not presume that all individuals are basically the same, and that individuals who do not display the ideal characteristics are somehow fall short of those ideals. It actually argues that individuals do have diverse characteristics, and that these diverse characteristics are not only a function of the individual's capabilities, but are actually socially constructed. And if they didn't exist in the individual, the social group would create them and move individuals to fill those roles to make sure that this distribution, even though unconsciously, that this distribution would obtain. So different things in this curve that help us to better understand how the social group works. I've already mentioned the outer possibilities, the outer limits of this distribution curve are what I would call the natural elite. These are individuals who have developed the maximum skill set for interacting with other group members. They have some combination of sociational and instrumental skills that they think is appropriate, that they value, and that they see as their contribution to the group and their means by which they interact and identify with the larger group. Of course, they identify with the larger group as long as the group is compatible with their values, their norms, and their goals and their aspirations. They're loyal to the group as far as the group serves their interests. They can, of course, leave the group. They can move their place on the group in reaction to group activities. And so there is a lot of dynamism, as we well know in social relations. The other important aspect of this is the top, the proactive sector of the Gaussian distribution. I call this the societal elite. These are the people who have developed the skill set to actually promote and reproduce and maintain and manage the social group. They are responsible for keeping this group viable and also salient according to their existential or circumstantial context. This is also can be referred to as the proto-state, that every social group has some governing structures, has some authority structure. The authority is based on the social norm. The social norm is based on what it takes to minimize the amount of instrumental behavior amongst group members. And so it changes according to the circumstantial context. And I would refer the reader to the brilliant treatment of the importance of circumstances on differences amongst social groups that was elaborated by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel. The proto-state, as the group becomes larger and more developed, becomes what we normally refer to as the state itself. As it becomes institutionalized, we can see that the societal elite are predisposed to form the state, or the governing structure for the group. Now this can be perverted. It doesn't always obtain. And especially in autocratic rule, the societal elite may not be in control of the governing structure, and we'll go into this a little bit more as we work through the various aspects of the complex model. But in this sense, it's important to note that the main function of democratic procedures are that to ensure that the societal elite are more likely to get into governing positions in the social identity group, rather than active or reactive individuals who are highly skilled at getting things done, but they are less efficient or effective in promoting group interests because they tend to prefer individual or subgroup interests over the larger group interests. What will be helpful to the current discussion is to point out that the societal elite, or proto-state, is representative of the diversity of interests of the social identity group itself and is populated by an array of moderates, that is, active and reactive individuals that are primarily proactive in their particular dispositional combination. The proto-state is not harmoniously proactive, but rather reasonably and deliberatively diverse. Under normal conditions, the proactive leader will gain precedence, but under crisis conditions, that is, when serious social conflict within the group, at least temporarily, remains unresolved, group leadership tends to migrate toward greater instrumentality as the group attempts to overcome a social obstacle or better manage an emerging challenge to the social order. If the crisis is not resolved within a reasonable amount of time, this active-reactive contention within the proto-state may lead to group polarization or factionalism, a problem we will discuss later in this video sequence. And so in order to maintain the group interests themselves have to be promoted actively and reactively by the most skilled and proficient members of the group, and that would be in this top echelon within the Gaussian distribution. And identifying those individuals has always been problematic, and ensuring that they get into governing positions has also been extremely problematic. And democracy has emerged as one way of identifying and ensuring that these individuals actually decide policy. It does this through voting, but in order to get voted into office, the theory is that individuals would have to have a lot of social connections, have to have interact cooperatively with large numbers of individuals, have a reputation for acting in this way, and that in doing this, they've identified themselves as proactive societal elites, and at the same time have a large enough following or a large enough support base that recognizes their importance for maintaining group interests or promoting or guiding group interests, that they can win in a contest to see who has the largest support base. And so identifying societal elites and making sure that they're in governing positions is the activity of the social group that is not only organic in that it builds on the dynamics of the group itself, but it also makes the group persist over time. It gives it duration and longevity. If the group is not successful in this basic function, the group tends to disappear. And groups that have poor performance, are poorly led, or do not act in the common interests of the group itself, will fail. And this is the basis then for one of the problems that we're interested in understanding, and that is state failure. If the state does not promote and prolong the existence of the group and actually lead the further development of the group, the poor performance of the leadership will cause the group to fail. So to summarize, the social identity group model is the basic building block of far more complex societal systems. And it's universal to all societal systems. This model posits that all social groups are organized according to the same essential principles. Number one, organizational cohesion is based on an existential trade-off between instrumental strategies and sociational strategies within the group. And this applies only to members, relationships with members within the group. And we'll get into intergroup relations later in this sequence. Number two, nature, nurture, and choice combine to array individuals within the Gaussian distribution that constitutes the group's social form. Number three, social learning determines the movement of individuals within the group. Number four, the RO, central pole, is relative zero, and this is the position where coercive action with group members is rejected and is the basis for rule of law. And, of course, democracy. Democracy has procedures, but the essence of democracy is the rejection of the rule of force in favor of the rule of law. Number five, optimal capabilities populate the perimeter of the curve, and that any individual will have some unique combination of predispositions to use either instrumental or sociational strategies depending on the particular context that individual is operating within. And six, each social group has a governing proto-state of proactive elites, and that if it's well governed, it is because it has enabled these societal elites to have the position of authority and to govern group activities.